Happy Old Year! Welcome to this edition, the last video of 2023 and the first of 2024. This is where we put 20 items on eBay and you can check them out and see how they're doing in the marketplace. These all are going on eBay auctions, and our first one is now a true antique because it is this piece here. This is moss agate, the treatment in the glaze, and this was developed by Frank Farrell. And Frank Farrell is probably the most prolific and the most iconic pottery designer in the United States in the 20th century. He started out working for Weller Pottery because he was just 16 years old, he needed a job, and he lived in Zanesville, Ohio, and they put him to work decorating slip on Luelsa line. The Owens Company across the street said, hey, we'd like to make something like that. They hired him, and he brought a lot of those design ideas over there. But he really wanted to produce moss agate with this interesting rubbed glaze that gives it the appearance of age without it actually being old. This piece is now 100 years old, but it has always had this greening on it because that was the idea behind it. Weller looked at it and said, not interesting, which is really interesting because Weller at the time was the biggest pottery company in the world. And it would have been really easy for somebody to take that rejection and say, oh, well, I guess this isn't a good idea. But Frank Farrell knew that he had something. And so he went to the Peters and Reed Company right down the street because all sorts of pottery companies were located in Zanesville at that time. And Peters and Reed said, why, sure, let's give that a try. It did so well that Peters and Reed changed their name to Zaneware and stayed in business for many more years on the basis of this. This was wildly popular in the 1920s. There's the Zaneware mark. This didn't look like anything else being made in its time, and that was part of the reason it was such a success. Frank Farrell then was hired by the Roseville Pottery and designed all of their Art Deco floral lines. This is a hanging basket. You can see the little holes there. You would hang it with string or rope or chain, and then you could put your plants in it and they would drape down elegantly over your table. So this is a really cute piece. They're glazed on the inside so they can be used. This one appears to have never been used. We are starting this off at a not very high price, so you can check it out on eBay. This is our bonus video for level 2 and level 3 members, by the way. If you are a level 2 or 3 member, you can watch these things drop on eBay as you're watching this video. If you are not a level 2 or 3 member and you're interested in getting early access, then please go to memberships below the dotted line in this video, and you'll be able to find out more about how to do that. We're very grateful to our members who let us put this bonus content out and make these extra videos possible. Our next offering, these are so cute. These are Holt Howard, and I think they're screaming in my ear, whack, whack, whack. These are called Pencil Pals. This was a desk set. The Holt Howard Company was innovative in its own way. They had the two Howard brothers, and one of them was an artist and had graduated from Harvard Business School, and they and their friend Grant Holt got together. Grant Holt had gone to Sweden to do some additional training and noticed that the Swedish potteries were making all sorts of cute Christmas figures. And he came back and said, gee, we could do something like this. But everything that was being made on the East Coast in the ceramic industry was very traditional and rather dowdy and rather staid. In 1951, there was a huge gift show in New York, and they would not allow any of the California or West Coast companies to participate because they thought what they were making was kitschy and schlocky and didn't have any importance in the market. So the California companies got together and rented a hall across from the gift show in 1951, and the gift buyers were knocked out by all of these fun designs. And that turned the East Coast pottery industry on its ear. So the Holts and the Howards, who were based in Manhattan at the time, said, hey, we're going to start making Christmas things initially in Japan, where we can do these designs, and they will be inexpensive and they'll be fun and not traditional and staid. Well, it was such a success that they got into all sorts of department stores. They were a big account of JCPenney's at one time, but a lot of other stores picked them up as well. And so by the late 50s, early 60s, they were making all sorts of fun things, including this. This is Pencil Pals. This is a desk set. And you see the one piece here. It has the original label on it still. This was to hold your pens and pencils. And then the other piece is this guy. He is the pencil sharpener. Now he appears to have been retouched right underneath the beak here. I don't know if that was a factory flaw or what, but I noticed that it's a little darker than the rest of the gold, so I want to point that out because we're always big believers in honest, open representation of items. But cute as can be, seeing the two of them together is an unusual enough thing, but the best part is this has the original box with the original straw that they used to ship these in from Japan. And there you go. So this would have been done so that you would have one of these on display and a whole stack underneath, and people could walk up and pick up the box and take it to the register. And somebody did with this one, but then they never appeared to actually use it. So we have this great set in the original box. I just think these are the greatest things. They're so cute, they're so fun, and we are going to start them off at $49 and just see what the market is, because you don't see these sets very often at all. And I don't really know where the market should be now because I don't see any that have sold in the recent past. And that's part of the reason that I do eBay auctions. I know some people want to put things on eBay at full price and just wait for their customer, and that's a perfectly legitimate way of selling things. But when you're not sure what that price is, how do you find out? Well, in this case, we're going to let the market tell us what the value is on these. And I figure that since a lot of people are indoors for the winter, desk sets, well, this is a good time to sell them. We are doing some buy it nows. The first piece I showed you, the Peters and Reed, is starting at $19 and has a buy it now of $29 on it. I will be traveling, so small items that I can easily ship from anywhere will be buy it now, and things that either need the market to tell us more about them or are a little more difficult for me to transport will be running for the entire 10-day auction. We do these as 10-day auctions so that we can let everybody have a chance to see what they are. I lived in Seattle when the Seattle Supersonics were still a team, and unfortunately the NBA at a certain point decided to pretty much abandon the Northwest, other than the Portland Trail Blazers, who were well established. But for a brief while, they had a team called the Vancouver Grizzlies. And the Vancouver Grizzlies, well, they're now the Memphis Grizzlies, because expanding the NBA into Canada turned out to be a little bit harder than they thought it might be. The Toronto team did pretty well and has survived, but the Vancouver team had a lot of trouble, and that's why things with the Vancouver team and the Vancouver logo are now pretty collectible, because they only made it for about 6 seasons before they were transferred to Memphis. This particular one has never been worn. It has all of its logo information on it here, and that may in part be that this hat came out right about the time of the 1988 to 89 NBA lockout. The Vancouver Grizzlies never won more than 23 games in an 82-game season, so they were never a good team. They got a lot of high draft picks, and when the NBA lockout came, they were 8 wins and 42 losses, and the most dismal team in the league. They got a couple of really high draft picks, and one of them was a fellow named Steve Francis. Steve Francis ended up being the Rookie of the Year the next year for the Houston Rockets, because he refused to play in Vancouver after he had some sort of an incident at the Vancouver airport. He decided that it was too far in another country with higher taxes, and that was not for him. So he refused to sign a contract with Vancouver and ended up being traded away. And between that and the lockout, the fan support just plummeted. And suddenly they were only drawing about 13,000 per game, and that was not enough to keep them there. Because of that, not a lot of Grizzlies paraphernalia was sold, and it's pretty collectible now because it's one of those defunct orphan teams, and a lot of sports collectors actually get interested in the teams that are no longer. So because this has never been worn, because it's in perfect condition, it has a one-size-fits-all strap, as most of these caps do. And it's starting at $9.99. We have a buy it now of $29, which is about what these typically sell for. So we'll see how this one does. The next item I have to show you is hanging up right behind us, and it's very bright and colorful and fun. And that is because it's a mola. Molas are beautiful, they're piecework, and they are done by the Guna Indians of Panama. And Panama, in 1986, held the Miss Universe pageant. And so this is unusual because it was actually given out or sold at Miss Universe as a premium. There are a handful of designs that were done for Miss Universe, and it makes it a really interesting variant on a fabric piece that is considered very collectible now. In the 80s, when this was made, molas really started to be collected and understood by people outside of Panama, and that's the reason that they made these. I think I have 3 different variants. I'm going to put this one online and see how it does, because this is another thing. I have seen no recent sales for these. The 1986 Miss Universe pageant was won by Barbara Palacios, who is now a Latin American TV host, and she was Miss Venezuela. She had an interesting story. She came from a very dysfunctional family. The parents broke up, and when the mother and she were walking somewhere when she was 12 years old, the head of the Miss Venezuelan pageant saw her and said, "You are going to be Miss Venezuela." And she said, "I would never want to do anything like that." Well, then she grew up and was 17 years old, and he kept track of where she was and approached her again, and she said, "No, I want to go to college. I want to be an advertising executive. I want to have a serious life. I'm not interested in beauty pageants." And he said, "Well, I'm going to keep trying." So she went to school and she graduated, and at 22 was a junior advertising executive when he approached her again, and she said, "Fine, okay, I'll go ahead and be in the local state pageant, and then we'll just get this out of the way." Well, she won. And then she won Miss Venezuela. And then she won Miss South America, and all of a sudden she was in the Miss Universe pageant, and she won that too. Because she wasn't just beautiful, she was also very smart and very talented, and she has had a very interesting life since then. It ended up being a launch pad for the rest of her career, and she's done very well in life. So beauty pageants are not always just about looking good and being pretty. Sometimes they really are the most talented person in the area, and they get the recognition that they need. So the Guna Indians have now had recognition for the beauty that they present, and so did she. This piece I think is really cool, fun, interesting, and a different variation on these. We are going to start this at $29. We're not doing a buy it now on this because, like I say, we haven't seen any of these with the Miss Universe label sell. And when we have something that hasn't sold and there's no recent comparable sales, well, sometimes you can either put this in the closet, forget you own it, pull it out years later and think, why did I never sell this? Or you can put it on and find out. And since I have 2 other variations of this, once we sell this one, we might have a better idea of what the market is. So let's see what happens. Next, we go from something very beautiful to something rather ugly that has a very interesting story. This little gas mask pin is a dress or scarf clip. You can see that because on the back it doesn't have a regular pin back, it has this interesting clip. On the back it says "Bundles for Britain." On the front it says "Britain can take it," and they are implying that Britain is going to stay strong through the attacks. They're going to put on their gas masks and they're going to go about their lives, and we are going to help them. Bundles for Britain was started by a wealthy New York socialite named Natalie Wales Latham. And she had a knitting club that would work in a storefront in New York City sewing socks and other garments for soldiers in Britain during the time that we were not yet involved in World War II, but we could see it coming. And so we were really trying to support the British against the Germans in the war effort. Because of her connections and because she was doing something that was seen as a very worthy cause, a number of organizations around the country sprung up, and pretty soon there were 1,000 different organizations in every state supporting Bundles for Britain with various contributions. They raised over $1 million cash and sent over $1.5 million in clothing and bedding and medical supplies and medical devices to England before we got involved in the Second World War. She was so successful at it that King George V made her the first non-British citizen to get an OBE, which is a Commander of the Order of the British Empire. It's an award given to people who do noteworthy things for the support of Britain. Typically you see the pin that has the lion above the Union Jack with the French motto on it. This is an unusual one because it is a different style, and these would have cost $2.50, which was a lot of money at the time, but most of it was going to war relief. So people did buy these, but not in large quantities. And so this one is uncommon. This is another thing that we have not seen sell on the computer in recent times. So we're starting this at $19. We are not doing a buy it now on this because we really need, again, the market to tell us what the interest in these things are. But there are a lot of collectibles related to bundles for Britain, and a lot of them go to war buffs and military memorabilia collectors, as well as people who like interesting costume jewelry. Bundles for Britain was so successful, they even got Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland to do a live radio show as a fundraiser, which was one of the most successful ones that they did. Which makes an interesting segue to this next piece, because this next piece has to do with the St. Louis World's Fair. Now, those of you who are movie buffs and musical buffs might remember Clang, Clang, Clang Went the Trolley, as sung by Judy Garland, in the movie Meet Me in St. Louis, which came out in 1944. 40 years after the fair was held. That's how much influence on the culture the St. Louis World's Fair had. And you can see why when you see these. These are 25 stereo cards, duo-type views as they called them, in a not perfect sleeve, but the cards have remained in wonderful condition because they kept the sleeve, and they show all sorts of attractions along the Pike, which was the big amusement center in the middle of the St. Louis World's Fair. The St. Louis World's Fair took place in Forest Park, which was not actually designed by the Olmsted brothers. There is a lot of confusion about that. A lot of people think that the Olmsted brothers or Frederick Law Olmsted designed it. Actually, one of his proteges got the contract after he worked for the Olmsted brothers. But you can see some of the tenor of the World's Fair here. This particular building is talking about Indian chiefs. Geronimo actually lived there in a teepee and was one of the attractions at the World's Fair. There were actually a lot of race-based exhibits at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair because in addition to celebrating the 100th anniversary of our territorial expansion with the Louisiana Purchase, it also was promoting the idea that we were now a colonial power because the Spanish-American War had just ended. So they brought Igorot natives over from the Philippines and had them in an exhibit. They had Guamanians in an exhibit. They had other Native Americans doing craft work and basketry. All of them were presented as being very interesting people. All of them were also being presented as very primitive people in order to justify the idea that we were now a colonial power. Theodore Roosevelt went to the fair after the election. He chose not to go before the election because he did not want to taint the fair with electioneering. Boy, his time changed. I can't imagine a politician would pass up a chance like that now. But also because he was a little dicey about the whole idea of us being a colonial power, and I don't think he completely was at peace with the notion. But the views are really interesting. This one shows a lot of beautiful sculpture. Now, these buildings were made of something called staff, which was a combination of plaster and hemp, because hemp was still legal to grow at this time in this area. The views are just really neat. You're supposed to put these in a stereo viewer and then you actually get a 3D view because these pictures, even though they look alike, are taken at slightly different angles. So when you put them in, your eyes, because of the way parallax happens, because our eyes are offset from each other, creates the 3D effect. It's a pretty neat trick. It was the same thing that eventually was used in Viewmaster reels for those of you who had those as kids. But it shows a bunch of the different buildings, a bunch of the different sculptures. There's one here that is called Cowboys. And that certainly gives a very specific idea of what the West was like. But again, this is 1904. The St. Louis World's Fair was the most expensive World's Fair staged at that time. It cost the equivalent of $500 million to put on in current dollars. And it was very well attended. It drew just under 20 million people. St. Louis in 1904 was really at its peak. They also hosted the Olympics that year, and there was serious consideration of moving the capital from Washington, D.C. to St. Louis because it was such an important city and in the middle of the country. St. Louis turned out was close to a peak then. There then was a big, huge flood on the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River soon was supplanted by rail travel as the primary way that people got around, and the importance of the river trade started to dwindle. So St. Louis was really at its peak and fever pitch when the fair came. It was a pretty exciting time, and that group of cards is a neat way to explore what it was like to be at the fair. We are starting those at $29 with a buy it now of $50. That's a pretty typical selling price for that particular set, and that's pretty good considering that's really only $2 per card. This pretty jar with the lid was intended to be a sugar bowl originally, but could be used as any sort of a jar because it does not have a spoon hole, so it is not specific to sugar. But it was done as the sugar bowl initially, and this is in a pattern called the Delaware pattern. It's early American pattern glass. This is coming towards the end of the pattern glass era. This was done in the 1890s by the U.S. Glass Company. U.S. Glass formed in the early 1890s as an attempt to monopolize glassmaking. They put 15 different glass companies together. It ultimately became Tiffin Glass. The monopolization did not end up working because there were too many other glass companies that would not join in. But they made a whole series, at least 30 different state patterns. This one is called Delaware. They made, some of the more famous are Colorado, Florida is a pattern that people look for. There are a number of different state patterns, and sometimes they had something to do with the state and sometimes they had nothing to do with the state. I've been to Delaware. I don't remember any of these 4-petal flowers like this, but the important thing is that the gilding is good on this and there are no chips or cracks. Early American pattern glass is one of the first things that became widely collectible when collecting, like we think of it, really started in the 1920s and then during the Depression, because it was just old enough to be interesting and you would find it in estates. And it was very different because look how thick it is. Even though it is molded like Depression glass, it is much thicker and heavier. And so people who liked old things thought, well, that's certainly better quality than what they're doing now. So they started collecting. And that's why we don't see a ton of this. I have seen this piece sold several times lately on the computer, but none of them had the lid, so they were not complete. And because of that, this one's a little bit more desirable. We're starting this at $9.99. Again, this one is not a buy it now because this would be difficult for me to take in my travels. I'm going to be flying in a plane and I don't want to have to check through things that might break. But we will see where this ends up at the end of the bids. I suspect it will sell somewhere in the $25 to $35 range, but we will let the market tell us. I sold the Navy ship recognition manual of these a few months ago on this 20 listings that I do every month. And I saw this and thought, you know, I think I want to give this one a try too, because this one is, again, restricted. It is the pictorial manual. I believe this is from 1943, and it shows U.S. Army aircraft and how to spot them. The very famous Spitfire, the British plane that was a stalwart in the Second World War. It shows German aircraft, including this Messerschmitt. It shows Japanese aircraft. And this was very important because you had to be able, just looking in the sky, just from a silhouette, to be able to tell whether the plane flying overhead was on your side or the enemy's side. And when they were restricted, that was because they were meant for military use by personnel in the field. These were not for public consumption. And restricted is a level of classification that if you broke it, like if you took this home and showed it to your friends or you showed it to someone in the press to impress them, you could get 5 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. They were very, very serious about classified information back then because showing this sort of thing to the enemy or to someone who might leak it inadvertently to the enemy could make the difference between life or death for people. So this stuff is serious. This one is intact. It has a few pages that are a little loose and a few that are a little dog-eared. I'm showing good pictures of all of that so people hopefully will get the idea of the condition it's in. We're starting it at $29. I have a buy it now of $45 on it because that is what the other piece with the ships went for, and that seems to be about what these sell for when we get them. Of course, they're not restricted anymore because the war is over, and we're not looking for these planes in the sky, we're looking for them in air museums. This little gal, we'll find out if she's discontinued. She is contemporary. I don't usually put contemporary items up on this, but she is from Shearwater pottery. And I got the pleasure of finally seeing the Shearwater pottery in Mississippi a very fascinating family-owned, still family-owned and run pottery that has been in business now for 100 years. So we have another thing where Shearwater pottery pieces are now starting to be in the realm of true antiques. 100 years or more is a true antique. Unless you're a car, then it's 50. This little gal is a beach Betty, a bathing beauty. She is typical of Shearwater cast pieces in that she has this graffito decoration in the slip, and that is a hallmark of theirs. Shearwater is a family-run business to this day. It was started by George and Annette Anderson and their 3 sons. Annette had gone to the Newcomb College in New Orleans, very famous for its pottery. Their pottery is the stuff of major museum exhibitions. When you find a piece, it is very expensive. And so they had pottery making interest. The sons were interested in it. And there was a potter in Biloxi, Mississippi, whose items are also the thing of museums, named George Orr. George Orr called himself the madman of Biloxi, and he made all sorts of weird, fantastic shapes in pottery and did all sorts of crazy things. When he died, Annette Anderson went to his estate sale and bought his kiln, and that was the kiln that they started with at Shearwater Pottery. So interesting how these links carry through history. Shearwater pottery went through a couple of hurricanes. Hurricane Camille did damage in 1969, but Hurricane Katrina almost wiped out the company. 16 of their buildings were lost. A lot of the family homes were lost. A lot of the historic buildings were lost. They took what they could salvage and rebuilt the company. It took them several years to get back into production, so we're lucky to still have them. It's now being done by, I believe, the 3rd or 4th generation of the family in many of the same manners. This is one of their marks. They also do a ink stamp, but this says 23. So we know this was made in 2023. So she's not very old, but she is the last one that they had, and they're not sure that they're going to continue to produce her. We know that, at least because she's dated, they're not going to produce any more that say 23. And so for that reason, because she was the last of last year's line, I decided that we're going to go ahead and put her on eBay, even though she's a contemporary item, because you can only get Shearwater pottery by going to the plant and buying it. They do not sell to any retail accounts and never have. So this is the only way you can get them. I was very pleased to have the opportunity to see the company, and I thought I would share the experience by putting her out to bid. And we're going to start her at $29. I believe that I have a buy it now of $49 on her. And I just think she's fun. They did some other things that are certainly much more sophisticated, but I like the pirates and the beach lines and all of that because it just sort of feels like the Gulf Coast of the United States. Well, last month we put Star Wars characters on our top 20. I had a very large collection, and we were curious to see whether the character from the first movie, the second movie, or the third movie, Return of the Jedi, would do the best. It turned out the character from the second movie did the best because it had a certain feature to it, little round holes in it that could stand on peg stands, that was introduced right before that line was discontinued and the line for the new movie came out. And so because of that, that ended up being the big winner. Well, this time I decided we're going to try, because I had 3 more left, and the 3 characters I kept out are the 3 that I thought were the most recognizable from the collection that I got. This first one, I'm showing you in the safety pack, these collector packs. This is R2-D2. And this one, by the time of the Return of the Jedi, now R2-D2, of course, had been made since the original issue, but this one had a new feature because his little sensor scope came out. And that is the reason that this one was a different model than the ones that were made before. And I'm curious to see whether that means it will sell for more than the previous models or less. There are things to know that we learned last month. People want to know how many characters are on the back because that tells you what point in time these came out. At this point they had 65 characters. They also want to know whether they're punched or not. Punched means that they were hung on a rack, so the little paper hole here was punched out when they put it on the rack. The characters that sell for more, all other things considered equal, are the ones that are unpunched, like this one, which is C-3PO. This C-3PO is also a new model at the time. This is for Return of the Jedi. This C-3PO, the arms come apart, it has a cape, it's more complicated than the original C-3PO, because in Return of the Jedi, there's a scene where C-3PO is in pieces and Chewbacca has to carry him out in pieces, and so they wanted kids to be able to emulate that, because a lot of the interest in these was kids playing with them and reenacting the movie, because Star Wars was one of the first movies I remember as a kid. I saw it once, I thought it was great. I'm not such a sci-fi person that I went back and saw it again and again, but I knew kids in school who saw it 10 and 12 times. They went over and over and over, and they could tell you every line, and they could act out all of the stuff with all of the characters, which is why even more obscure characters started to be made. So by the time this one is made, there are 77 characters, so it's a 77 back. And then this one was a new character, an important character. This one is Lando Calrissian. And it's interesting because the actor who played him was not their first choice, but he did a great job and was very well known for his role in Star Wars. And this one is a 65 back. So you can see the progression of interest in these as time went on. So we're going to put all of these up. I had sales of individual pieces as high as $250 each in the last batch. I'm curious to see how these are going to do. Because I did so well with the other pieces, I have decided to list these at $9.99 with no reserve. And we're just going to let the market in this period of time tell us where things are. And I'm curious to see whether they'll sell for as much as they did in December, or whether gift buyers were part of what was propelling the market, and if the market is not quite as strong when we just have collectors. We're going to find out together. This is part of the reason I like to do this, is because we get to experiment a little and get different impressions of how markets change in the antique and vintage business. Because nowadays, with all the online selling, with much more availability of information than there used to be, markets are much more fluid than they used to be. It used to be we'd get a collector's reference book at the beginning of each new year, and it would tell us about how much the different things were, and we would all price those items exactly the same all year long. And then the next year we'd rush and get the new book and see if we could raise the price on anything. Well, now we have much better information. Better information makes markets more liquid, and we're going to see what the market is today. About the time I first saw Star Wars is about the first time I saw one of these. One of my friend's dads liked these, and they kept buying them for him as gifts, and he'd been a doctor, so they got him one that was a doctor, and then they got him one that was a dentist. Well, it turns out that this outfit, Romer from Italy, which had a tradition of carved wood figures already because of the Henri Company and just a long history of carving all the way back to the Middle Ages. Well, Romer did things a little differently. Their characters were a little more simple, but they were larger, they were often polychrome, and if they were more complex like this, they were more expensive and more desirable at the time, and that has remained true through today. I saw a listing on First Dibs for a collection of these where they were going for $125 a piece if they were able to sell the collection. They often are missing their paper label. This is one of the first I've seen that actually had it. There is the Romer Made in Italy label. But when they are on a base and they have more pieces, this guy's got a milk pail and he's got his pitchfork and he has his can of milk. And so because he's more complicated, he's a little bit more valuable. I suspect that $125 is too high, but I wouldn't be surprised if he sold for half that much, and we're going to find out. These were carved of maple. The carving is very good, and like I say, they're not as chippy and detailed as an Henri piece or a Tory art piece, but it definitely has a smoothness and an appeal that is a little different than some of those Italian carvings, and a lot of people really like these. A lot of people were collecting them 40 and 45 years ago, and that's why we're starting to see them come out in the marketplace and new collectors and new collections are forming. This piece is very interesting to me because it spells the end of tragedy and the end of the Second World War. This is made by Porcelain Vlies, which is part of the Delft group. There is the mark on the back. Royal Delft is the only one of the 17th century Dutch ceramic companies still going. And the Delft company of late has been trying to impress on people that it is a high quality ware and to try to go upscale. And if they're successful in that, I think that there will become more collectors for their older pieces. In the meantime, this one's interesting for a few other reasons. This one is depicting the liberation of the Netherlands at the end of World War II. The Dutch were one of the first countries invaded by Hitler, and so they suffered the longest. You can see the liberators flying over, and they're dropping not bombs, but food stuff. At the bottom here, it says food, peace, and freedom in Dutch. And food was something they really needed. So you see the woman and her little child, and they are waving flags, partly to say hello and partly to say, we are here, please give some to us. You can see the barbed wire fence that they've walked through. It is a new day dawning in the background. Porcelain Fleece did several of these plaques, and I would like to know more about them. If anyone out there has more information, because some of the ones I've seen depict things like the railway strike when the Dutch refused to run the trains in 1944 and took their lives into their own hands because they wanted to help cut off the German war effort. And so there was a railroad strike, and that was commemorated in one of these plaques. There seem to be several in this series, and I'm curious whether they were produced after the war or if they were produced during the war to commemorate some of those things that happened. In any event, I think it's a really interesting series to collect. The collectors for this could be Delft collectors. It also might be people who like tiles. It might be people who are interested in war memorabilia and history. In any event, it's a pretty beautiful piece in terms of the detail and the color and the design. I haven't seen this particular one sell lately. I've seen other ones that sell in the $85 range, and that is our buy it now on this. I am asking $29 to start, so we're going to see somewhere in that range where this piece ends up and who it ends up going to, and I think it'll be a great addition to somebody's collection depending on what their interest is. After the war, in happier times in neighboring Denmark, this piece was made, and boy is it happy and fun. I just think the vibrancy of the colors is really neat. This piece has a great signature on the back, and it's somebody that is not well known by potters, but it's well known by modernists that her work is very good. This is Bo Melander. Bo is short for Bobby. Bobby Melander won a competition when she was a student at the Danish School of Arts and Crafts. She won the 1948 Christmas competition for designing pixies. And she was so heralded for that that she decided that making pixies was going to be her thing. And so she started a pottery company when she got out of school. And the pixies actually are still produced today, although she has since retired and a new person is the one doing the designs. By the 1960s and 70s, she was doing paperweights and other small objects that had a very fun modernist feel like this. I just like the polka dots. The colors are so bright and vibrant. The glaze is really good. If you look at the quality there, there's no burns and no overflow, and it's just a really cute piece. It's got a very distinct mark on it. This little piece here that digs deep into the piece, this was so that it had some sort of a thing lifting it off the kiln so they could take it off easily, and this wouldn't stick to the kiln, and that's why you don't see scratches and scrapes and them having to finish it off. So they had a thought about quality. The Danes, of course, were at the vanguard of 20th century modernism, and these pieces tend to do really well. Her paperweights oftentimes sell for as much as $100. We're starting this one at $49, and we're going to see where it goes. We do have a buy it now of $95 on that one. So we'll see if somebody grabs it right away, or if we just wait for it to sell and see how it does. But I just thought this had a lot of verve. We'll see in 2024 whether the craze for petroleum continues. Petroleum is anything collected that's related to gas and oil companies and stations. And that could be anything from big old porcelain signs to the kids' toys that Texaco made. But this piece comes from an outfit called DX. And DX was the Diamond Petroleum. It started out as Sunray in Tulsa in the 1920s. They bought the Diamond Company that had a bunch of gas stations in the upper Midwest and Plain states and the Mid-South. And then they came up in 1933 with a new invention that they patented, where they could put in an additive that would lubricate the upper part of the cylinder while the gas went through. And that was important because lubrication keeps parts from sticking and things from breaking. And that was a very big innovation in 1933. And because of that, they took their diamond gas stations and they made them DX, and the X was the X factor, which was their secret formula that they wouldn't tell anybody, that caused that lubrication to happen at no extra cost. So this is a fairly early DX gas pump insert. This would have been at the pump to tell you that, hey, you're not paying extra to get this great thing that only our gas has. So this one's fairly early. This is going to be 1930s or early 1940s, back when they had the tall, skinny tombstone-shaped pumps. This would have gone in the top to tell you what you were getting. And DX was very successful. They kept on going until 1968. Zeno's grandfather had the DX station in Dawson Springs, Kentucky, which is a very cute little building that's still there right in the middle of downtown. In 1968, they became part of Sunoco, and all the DX stuff was taken away, and most of it was thrown away. So I was happy to see this, because this one, even as DX pump signs go, is not something you see commonly. And again, I could not find any of these that had sold recently on eBay. So we're going to find out how this particular sign does, because it's a little more graphically interesting than the usual DX gas pump inserts. I'm starting this one at $39, and we're just going to let it run from there and see how it does. I do talk a bit about Black Americana on this channel because I think it's important for us to acknowledge the past and the way it was. But one thing that was really good in the 1970s is that people started to change their attitudes a little bit. And one thing that really helped was the appearance of this book. This is Roots by Alex Haley. It's the saga of an American family. Now, at the time, there was a big controversy as to whether this was fiction or nonfiction, and that controversy has remained. It turns out that Alex Haley, of course, wrote this from the standpoint of mainly the oral history he heard in his own family and what he could trace from that oral history by looking through things like slave sale documents and where plantations were and people who he mentions in the book and what information he was able to find about them. Like many oral histories in families, it turned out that some of it was accurate. Another very famous black historian couple figured out that some of it was not entirely accurate, and now there has actually been updates and there is a better understanding of his family's story than he actually even had when he was alive. But a lot of the basic framework not only was correct, but even the parts that were not specifically true to his family, he had gleaned from reading other oral histories from other black families, and so it all had a basis in fact. And that is why it was a very anticipated book when it came out in 1976, and this is one of the first copies with his full signature. And here he is on the back. I remember as a kid that Roots came out in 1977 as a mini-series. Mini-series were not a thing in 1977. Usually you did a series over a number of weeks, but ABC, which agreed to put Roots out as a mini-series, was really afraid that there would be backlash or that the ratings would be bad because it was about African Americans. It turned out exactly the opposite. It ended up that the final installation of Roots was the third, to this day, the third most watched television show in the history of television. People were really fascinated, and it really opened a lot of eyes to people who were not African American about how slaves really were treated, because in the book he talks of both very good and very bad treatment of his ancestors that he heard through these oral histories. It also talks about some of the things that happened, and yes, indeed, a few of them were given some skills because they were trained to do certain things, but they were not given education, and his family actually did not prosper until after the Civil War when they were able to make their own way. But the story of Kunta Kinte, who was a real person and a real ancestor of his, has definitely transcended through time, and this has turned out to be a very important book. Even if it wasn't completely accurate to his family's history, it definitely captured the idea that African Americans do have a history, that it can be traced, and that there is information available. And it has caused a lot of African American families to trace their history, which is part of why we now know that Thomas Jefferson sired a number of half-black children and other things like that, that have really turned the notion of racial purity on its head. So I think it was a very, very important and influential book, no matter what controversy it might have stirred. I'm starting this at $9.99. I have a buy it now of $59 on it, which is a pretty medium price for this book with a full dedicated signature like that. And I am very curious to see how it does, because it is a pretty fascinating read. Another Southern institution that's really changed is this one. This is the Randolph-Macon Women's College. And this was a mirror done as a reverse painted silhouette that was sold in, I would say, from the framing around 1940s or 50s. And I'll hold it up so you can see the condition and also all of my camera equipment. This is the back. It is all original. I thought this was a really interesting piece because this is a very interesting university. It was one of the Methodist schools. They had Randolph Men's College already in Virginia, and they kept trying to get the Board of Regents to approve women to go there, and they did not want to make it coeducational, but at a certain point they finally relented in 1893 and said, we won't make it co-ed, but we'll build another university that is a women's college. So Randolph-Macon's Women's College opened, and it was one of the finest educational institutions in the South. It was the first women's college south of the Potomac River to get Phi Beta Kappa accreditation. It had some really noteworthy attendees, including the novelist Pearl S. Buck, and talked so much about her experiences in China. And this is where she studied. Candy Crowley, the CNN correspondent, is also an alum of Randolph-Macon Women's College. But if you go looking for Randolph-Macon's Women's College, you will not see it anymore, because in 2007 it went co-ed and became Randolph College. And that was not without controversy. A lot of people who had attended Randolph-Macon as a women's college were not interested in seeing it go co-ed, interestingly enough, because they felt that there already was the men's college, which I believe also has gone co-ed now, and that they liked the idea of it being focused on a women-only school. But in this day and age, co-ed is pretty much the way most universities are, and that has to do in part with different ideas in our society about the education and involvement of men and women together in their college years. But it also has to do with the fact that private universities are very expensive, and cutting off half of the potential applicants is not necessarily a good way to keep your university going. So items from Randolph-Macon Women's College are actually rather collectible, particularly a lot of the old Scammell Lamberton china that they used in the mess halls. But this particular piece is unusual in that it is a full wall mirror. And this is something that a handful of people would have bought, either attendees or more likely given as gifts to people who were helping the attendees through school. So this is not something I've ever seen before. It's reverse painted on glass like a silhouette would have been. It should date to sometime in the 1940s, possibly early 50s. And we're going to start this at just $19.99 and see where it goes. I try to find things that are unusual to share with you in these top 20 drops, and I also try to find things that I think are unusual to share with everybody out in eBay land. So we'll see what the market thinks of this. I have a set of these coasters in maroon and navy, and I just love them. I've always liked this shape. This is Knowles China, and this was done in the 1930s. This is called the Yorktown blank. Now, in the big dishes, they typically have, if they have any design, things like potted plants on little staircases and such. But in its pure form, where it's just the Art Deco design, it is every bit as interesting as Fiesta to me. I love the way that the tab handles come out, and they're just an extension of the design. It just has such motion and streamlining, very, very much streamlined deco from the 1930s. And this one's interesting because it shows somebody with a really impressive poker hand, 4 aces and the joker. You really can't beat that. And I think that was the point, because what they're trying to get you to do is buy American. This is from the 1930s. In the 1930s, there were high tariffs. You could not import a lot of things from Japan and Germany by the late 1930s because we had trade restrictions. And so the American pottery companies actually were doing very well under all that protectionism, although it did make it considerably more expensive for the customers. So if you went to the factory, they were doing well enough they could give you this as a souvenir and remind you to keep buying American. It does not say Knowles on it. You just have to recognize the blank. But because I have this set of coasters in the solid colors, I recognized it right away. East Liverpool, Ohio, of course, is where Fiesta ware is made. A lot of different dinnerware and pottery manufacturing companies there. It is not an expensive thing because it's small. We're just starting it at $9.99 with a buy it now of $19. But I can't say I've ever seen this piece before, and I think it's rather interesting. I don't know who it was who went to that plant originally, but their souvenir can be your souvenir of the once great American ceramics industry. We had a lot of live sales in December where we sold a lot of really wonderful Fenton artware. And we sold one of the 3 sets that I know of from this line, which is the Fenton Nativity. This particular one is the Holy Family. This one, because the person I was selling with had pieces from it, I did not put up for sale. It is a time after Christmas that a lot of people are packing away the Christmas for the next year, but it's also a time that traditionally people go out and look for Christmas things to add to the box so that they will have them for the next year. And this is the Holy Family. I'll hold it up here as best as I can. I don't want them to fall out of the box, but you can see that we have the 3 pieces here, and I'll take them out and show you individually. Here is Joseph with a very regal robe with purple painting and the Fenton logo there. Interestingly enough, each one of these was decorated by a different person, even though they were sold together in the same box, because all of this was piecework. So you had people working side by side in the decorating department together. There is the baby Jesus in the manger. By the way, the manger is just the crib. A lot of people have that confused. They think the whole creche is a manger, but it is actually the crib. A manger was something that was used for cattle feed back in the time. And there's the hand painting on that. And then here is Mary, and she has a lovely robe and is decorated all the way to the back. These sets are not easy to find, and they sell for pretty good money, and they seem to sell year-round. So I thought it would be interesting to put this online and see what the market right after the holidays is. My suspicion is that it will do well because they are not easy to find, and because even though the box has tape on it, it has the original box and all the pieces are in great condition. Our penultimate piece is a scrap of paper. Isn't that wonderful? Why would you sell a scrap of paper? Well, okay, it's the old Great Northern Railway, and sure, this was a pad of paper that they had on board, and yeah, it's got the trains on it, but there's only half of it there. Why would anyone want to collect this? Well, because the reason there's half a piece of paper is somebody on board recognized a certain somebody and said, would you please sign something for me and grab this piece of paper? And she signed it to Steve, best wishes, Gogi Grant. Gogi Grant started out life as Mildred Ahrensberg. Her parents moved to Venice, California when she was a kid, and she won a teenage song contest and decided she really liked singing. Was working selling cars in Los Angeles, but never really lost the idea that she might like to do something in the musical industry. She ended up meeting a producer who thought that her voice was very nice and that she might do rather well, and so he decided to rename her Gogi Grant based on the fact that he liked to go to Gogi's La Rue restaurant in California, and he just thought it was a fun and memorable name. So she became Gogi Grant, and she got a contract with Era Records and sang a song that many other people also covered called Suddenly There's a Valley. And that ended up being a top 10 hit in 1955. And so in 1956, they wrote some music specifically for her, and one of the songs was The Wayward Wind. And she had a very soaring voice. It's a very soaring, dramatic song, and it did really well. It went to the top of the charts, and it was her only #1 hit. But from that, she ended up having a pretty prolific career in the late 1950s. She had the star billing in The Big Beat, which is a 1957 music-related movie that had everybody from Fats Domino and Harry James to Cal Tjader in it, and she was the top of the star billing in that one. She also was involved with the first recording of Showboat on an LP record. So she had a pretty good career for a while. In her later years, she even was involved when she lived in Palm Springs in something called the Palm Springs Follies. So she never lost the interest in entertaining, even though the world changed and her kind of music was no longer the music of the day. She did have one more easy listening hit in the late 1960s. It's somebody who I knew only from listening to oldies commercials for records on television when I was a kid, but when I listen to the oldies station, I still hear The Wayward Wind once in a while, and I have to admit, it's a pretty dramatic and interesting song to listen to. So somebody else thought so too, and Steve is now sharing his autograph that he got on the train with us. I would say from the colors of the logo, which Great Northern changed in the 1960s, that this is a 1950s piece when she was at the peak of her popularity, and her signature and her fame is still known. I'm starting this at $9.99. They typically should sell for around $15, and we'll see if somebody else who understands old music likes it as much as I did when I saw it. And that brings us to our last piece for this flight, and this one is by a fairly serious artist by the name of Agnes Mills, the youngest person involved with the WPA art project as a teacher and mentor back in the 1930s, because she was considered something of a prodigy. She graduated from the Pratt Institute and became involved with the Bauhaus movement, was very, very interested in social realism. In later years, she did a lot of things that were involved with dance and motion. You can see her signature on the back of the plinth here. It's a scratch signature. There you go. You can see it in the light. And I got this piece and someone had already put some information on the bottom. This one is called Little Monument. This one actually is more brutalistic and a little bit more of a static image than she typically did. She did all sorts of different types of art, everything from batik paintings to computer-assisted drawing by the time she was elderly. And her work is pretty well known and goes for pretty good prices. Even though this is a rather small piece that came from a Florida gallery later in her career, I'm starting it at $49 with the understanding that it should sell for probably somewhere around $100. Larger sculptures of hers can sell in the thousands, and there have been various exhibitions of hers that have traveled around the country. She is somebody who was greatly respected in her time and was a mentor to a lot of other artists. That was something that she really enjoyed, where a lot of artists tend to be solitary figures who keep to themselves and focus on what they do. She really wanted to share her gift and help other people to share theirs. So Agnes Mills has some real cachet in the art world, and this small bronze is a very interesting piece of her legacy. So I'm very happy to bring that to you, and I'm always happy to bring interesting things that I find and make them available in this manner so that everybody has a chance to see how they do on eBay. Again, if you're a level 2 or level 3 member, you're getting early access to this, so you're going to get to see it first and have the first chance to bid on it. But we do open it up to everybody. You'll see the links in the bottom of the description here, so click on them and you can see how these pieces are doing in the real world on eBay auctions, and we'll find out what the market thinks right now of this very widely varied group of antiques and vintage items. So have fun, and we will see you again next month with what sold, how much it went for, and our next grouping of 20 items. If you enjoyed this video, check out this one. Also, click thumbs up to like this video and check the description for information about our Patreon, our memberships. We've got a lot of different levels with different perks and bonus videos and early content. Also, please do check out our website, theantiquenomad.com, for appraisal help. And we'll see you again for more adventures in the antique and vintage community soon. Bye for now.